So, hello again, everyone. I'm Marsha Davis. I'm the executive director of the ZEDEC Social Justice Fund. And we are super excited to have you joining us for today. This is actually the second webinar within our Bold People Magic Dreams series, where we're sharing the results of a community research process that we've engaged in 2018. And we've been spending the last 3 to 4 years implementing the results of this community research in our organization. So we're glad to be able to share both the insights that came from our community and what the process has been for us to implement this work in our organization. Now, ZEDEC Social Justice Fund, our mission is to redistribute money, resources, and power to support systems change and community healing in Asheville, North Carolina. Through adaptive, trust-based philanthropy, we resist oppressive systems and work to transform our collective home into a place where everyone flourishes. This mission, we're proud of it not only because it speaks to our values, but also it was one of the results of the community's research process. We took words and values that came from our community leaders and used that to help redesign our organization. If you're interested in that process, you can go back to the recording of webinar 1 that's on our website. If you just go click to the About page and click to Community Research Findings, you'll see both a copy of our mini report and a recording of our first webinar so you can catch up on that conversation. Now, today we're going to focus on social justice philanthropy, the ways in which our community wants us to be bold, bold, bold in our grant making processes. Now, one of the guiding questions of our research was, is it possible for a funder to be a co-conspirator in the journey towards liberation? And when we talk about liberation, we're really focusing on collective liberation. So not just helping folks to thrive within inequitable and oppressive systems, but also supporting the creation of alternative systems that are not based in inequity, extraction, and exploitation. So that, for us at least, is how we're defining liberation in this moment. And I want to highlight a few key quotes that came from our community research in response to these types of questions. One, this felt like a very clear mandate from our community. Folks said if funders are really committed to social transformation, then they have to be willing to sit in the circle rather than being at the top, no longer being paternalistic. Another key piece of insight that we're going to use that helped really inspire us both in our transformation and in some of the work that we're sharing with you today. One of our respondents said, I think we're just at a political moment where funding is great, but sometimes speaking is more powerful than writing a check. And so how can funders show up in a way where they're also advocating for the people that they're funding? And how can funders organize other funders to invest money and resources? It may not even be money into the people who are on the ground doing the work. I want to name that this webinar series in particular is one way in which we're answering this call to speak to other funders and to share some of the work that they've said that our community leaders and grassroots leaders have said that they need from us as funders. We have a smaller budget than some of the larger funds that exist in our area, but we're using our relational capital to share and amplify the voices in our communities and to amplify their wisdom. And I want to dive immediately into sharing some of the practices that just came up in our research, right? And we're calling them liberatory philanthropic practices. But I think one of the things that's really fascinating to note about these key themes that emerged in our research is that they echo what some of more innovative and progressive funding practices have been emerging across the nation. I found it incredibly fascinating that we could poll local community leaders and still have emerged from within their expertise, just from doing the work, these frameworks that actually most funders are paying thousands to consultants to have them come up with these frameworks. And yet here and still, this knowledge and this brilliance is already in the grassroots leaders who are doing social justice work right here in Asheville. And so these innovative practices and these frameworks that are reflected in some of these key themes are the social justice framework, social justice philanthropy framework that's described by Resource Generation, among many other funders. Trust-based philanthropy, you'll see some themes of that emerge in these key themes that came from our data. Transformative philanthropy, which is a form of philanthropy that Solidaire is engaging in, and some reparative philanthropy, a model that's championed by the Decolonizing Wealth Project. You'll see some of these themes echoed here as well. So I think it's really important to hear both the voices of our local leaders and also know that there are some really wonderful frameworks that other funders are engaging in where they've also identified these key themes as well. So I think there's a lot of synergy here. So what the key themes, we're highlighting this part of our mini research report because I think those key themes are going to help you, especially if you're here as a funder, to think about specifically what are some concrete steps that you can take in supporting the social justice work that's happening here locally in Asheville and across the nation. One, the key ask that many of our research participants asked for was provide multi-year general operating support and provide both funding or technical assistance for capacity building. Many grassroots organizations are in a position where they don't have dedicated development teams, dedicated grant writers, etc. And so it's really important that if you're offering multi-year general operating support, that you're also offering some support beyond the check in the form of technical assistance and ensuring that our grassroots organizers can focus on the work that they have in hand, which is organizing our communities, doing some power building and base building. And whereas you as a funder are taking on some of the onus of supporting them in the grant writing portion of their work. We've also heard very loud and clear from our respondents that they need us to share decision-making about grants with impacted communities, those who are most impacted by the injustices that we hope to solve. They should be sharing in decision-making about where your grant dollars go. We spoke quite a bit in our last webinar about how ZEDIC is engaging in that process. And so if you want to hear more about the examples from us, that's also a place to go and find some information about how to do that practically. One of the other liberatory philanthropic practices that our respondents have asked us to lean into is to convene other funders to create spaces to push for sector change and advocate for grantees. Create spaces, use your relational capital to pull other funders into this work of liberatory philanthropy, social justice philanthropy, trust-based philanthropy, whatever you want to call it. But make sure you're starting to have these conversations. That's one of the things that our grantees and grassroots movement leaders really need. Another element, creating flexible and simple application and reporting processes that build connection. It's also incredibly important because when we talk about systems change work is not always easily quantifiable, right? So our old mainstream ways of reporting on grant outcomes where you're just talking about people served and how many people came in through the doors and how many people came out, you actually can't quantify a lot of social change work in that way. Can you imagine what Martin Luther King Jr. might have said or Ella Baker might have said if we asked them to quantify their social change and narrative change work? They probably would turn the other way and say, look, we're trying to do the work of changing the imagination of the nation. We may not have time to report on our grants in that way. And then you as a funder would be losing the opportunity to engage in some really powerful, historic, transformational work. So if you want to partner in doing some of the work that we know our country needs in this moment, it's important to create these flexible application and reporting processes. It's also important to move beyond grant making to regenerative redistribution. Invest in no to low interest community loan funds, land trusts, and cooperatives. This was especially important, our participants named, in part because they are really tired of funders showing up and engaging in charity or saviorism for their communities. There's a lot of brilliance, a lot of wealth, a lot of expertise that already exists in our communities, and they're already engaging in some powerful practices to build power and to reclaim some of the things that have been extracted from them because of white supremacy and capitalism. And so we have to engage beyond just writing a check or beyond thinking about this from a charity mindset and lean into the solidarity mindset with our communities. Look at the work that they're already doing and in both in terms of land trusts and cooperatives and support that. And also regenerative redistribution gives them the opportunity for them to pay back what they've received and use that to seed further work. It's also incredibly important that we shift towards a spirit of redistribution and repair by spending down assets and pursuing reparations in order to build security and restore wealth of Black and Brown communities. Now, this piece of liberatory philanthropic practice harkens back to some of the toxic roots of both philanthropy and capitalism and a lot of the wealth that our nation has amassed. Now, we know that a lot of the wealth that our country is built on, and perhaps a lot of the wealth that we're redistributing through philanthropy, has been obtained through extractive means, in particular, the institution of slavery. Then we think about the institution of redlining, all the ways in which we've pulled resources from Black, Indigenous, and people of color and hoarded resources in the top 1%. It's important for philanthropy to understand some of its toxic origins so that we can start to be strategic about how we repair those risks with the communities that we say that we want to serve, and also that we continue to start building wealth within those communities that we say that we want to serve. One of the viewpoints that have emerged in Zedek as we were doing our analysis building work is understanding that actually in a lot of ways, if we had a fair and equitable society, philanthropy would not exist. We would already live in a system where funds were not being extracted from our communities, where our communities would have what they needed to survive, so that we didn't have folks who were hoarding wealth to such an extent that they had this large amount of money to redistribute back into society. And so if folks were not engaging in these extractive relationships with, if the top 1% was not engaging in these extractive practices with the bottom 99%, then most likely they would already have the resources that they need to thrive. And so in some ways, philanthropy is set up to solve some of the problems that philanthropy and capitalism have created, right? And so this is a really big conundrum that a lot of our respondents in the community research process noted and said that we as a sector, we have to acknowledge that so that we are engaging in more equitable processes and reparative processes that acknowledge the harm that was created in the creation of our industry, right? A couple of other principles. It's important to create responsive accountability systems so that foundations can nimbly and quickly evolve to reflect emerging learnings, shifting landscapes, and community feedback. If you're a funder who wants to work with grassroots movements, who wants to work with social justice leaders and people who are engaging in systems change work in your community, it's important to know that because they are on the ground, they are seeing some emerging trends before most of us who are in philanthropy will see them, right? And so they are the experts in some of the shifting landscape in their work. They can tell you more what's happening with both with their communities and maybe the legislation or other policies that are impacting their communities. So if we want to be partners with them in this work, we have to listen closely and be ready to respond and to shift our approaches to respond to some of the insights that they have. It's also important as part of that process to prioritize deep and responsive listening as an indispensable skill set of foundation staff. Make time for your foundation staff to be able to listen and build deep and authentic relationships with their community. Many times, because we have the aspect of white supremacy culture, that false sense of urgency, many of our foundation staff are finding themselves kind of stuck in their offices, filling out grant reports, creating reports for their board, instead of actually deepening the relationships with their grantee partners or with local community leaders. These relationships are critical to making sure that you have effective grant making processes. So please open up the time for your foundation staff to go to the events, to visit your grantee partners, to listen to them one-on-one, not just in the coffee shop, but maybe in the community spaces that they've created and built. Show up for them. and make sure that that's a responsibility that your staff have. Another thing that's important is learn in public. Share your missteps and efforts to do better. Part of learning in public is allowing you the opportunity to build some of that relational trust with the movement leaders in your area. And importantly, many of our grantee partners and local leaders are asking us to boldly claim who we are as funders, what your analysis is, and what you hope to achieve. Part of this webinar series is us at ZEDEC answering that call, really clearly saying where we stand, what our analysis is, what our understanding is of some of the root causes of the inequities we hope to solve, and also learning in public. Here you are getting a chance to have this really informal conversation where we're going to share some of the insights of us trying to lean into these philanthropic practices. Here are the last two. Expand the role of foundation staff to include fundraising for your grantees and co-learning in community so that collective analysis can emerge. Now, the fundraising part we often don't see as part of a grant maker's responsibility. But the reality is that we often have the relational capital and the social capital to maybe reach other funders who may not know about our grassroots community partners and share the word about the amazing work that they're doing. And at the very least, make a warm handoff between our grantee partners and other sources of funding. The important thing to keep in mind here is that when we're engaging in liberatory philanthropic practices, we as funders are taking on some of the burden of grant making so that we are not distracting our grantee partners from the work that they're doing on the ground. We want them to spend more time doing social change work than they do courting funders and donors, right? Last piece, own and leverage your power, your financial resources, your networks, your skills, your capacities. Approach funding as an essential role that is part of the broader movements for justice. We at ZEDEC see ourselves both as a funder, but also as part of social justice movements in Asheville, right? To combat anti-Semitism, to bring about racial justice, and to bring about LGBTQ justice. So we have dual identities that we are living into. So here's your assignment now that you've gotten some of this work. So you're going to go back to your office, maybe later today, tomorrow, and you're going to talk to some folks, and they may say, well, what was the ZEDEC webinar like? What were the key takeaways? And if you hear nothing else today, the key takeaways are listen to your community and amplify their voices. If you're a funder in this space, share these principles with your teams. Know that ZEDEC, we are not the only organization that are leaning into some of these principles. This is a growing movement within philanthropic spaces to make sure that we are in right relationship with our grantee partners who are doing base building and grassroots organizing. Now, if you're a member of a nonprofit, go back to your funders and share this information with them as well. Push them to experiment with some of these principles and give them examples of how this will deepen your impact. Because chances are, if you're running a nonprofit, you already know that some of these principles would be so useful for you as you were engaging with a funder. And you are probably the best person to speak to why these practices will help you to supercharge your impact. So go ahead, it's all right to advocate for yourself. Chances are your funders will want to know what they can do to support you, and ask them to engage in some of these more liberatory philanthropic practices. Now, I have done enough talking. I would love to bring in the members of our panel who are going to share a little bit more about what the experience has been like in ZEDEC's world of having to do this work. Now, one of the members of our panel and who's going to be moderating our panel is Desiree Adaway, the founder and principal of the Adaway Group. She is a amazing, brilliant racial equity consultant, also deeply involved in organizational development. In so many ways, Desiree not just calls us to live into our truth, she calls all of her clients to live into their truth and their values around this work. So we're really glad to have you here, Desiree, moderating this panel.
Yay, happy to be here.
Yeah, great. And we're bringing in Amy Mandel again from our first panel back into the space. She's our funder and founder, has been engaged in philanthropic work for a very long time, since the 1980s, and has really been one of the visionaries behind and the brave, vulnerable soul who's really allowed us to step into some of these social justice philanthropic practices. So I'm really glad that you're here, Amy. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for
Okay.
that.
Yeah, anytime. We'll bring into this space as well Althea Gonzalez, who has a wealth of expertise both in the philanthropic world and in the nonprofit world as well. She is on our board. Who she's done some amazing grassroots work both in the Latinx community here in Asheville, and has done some amazing work across the U.S. facilitating community conversations, leading grant making programs, and providing consultation and training. Welcome, Althea. All right. Also in the room, we've got Jennifer Langton, who's our Director of Organizational Grant Making. Long history of work in the philanthropic sector. She applies trust-based philanthropy to her management of grant making processes. One of the first staff members here at the Zedek Social Justice Fund, and who has gone through the transition from the Amy Mandel Katina Rodas Fund to us being the Zedek Social Justice Fund. So welcome to the space, Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And Libby Kyles, who's our Director of Community-Led Grant Making. She has an extensive experience in education, nonprofit administration, and also just grassroots organizing here in Asheville, North Carolina, doing everything from founding Youth Transformed for Life. That's an after-school program for youth here in Asheville. She's also the chair of the board of the Asheville Buncombe Community Land Trust. Was on the founding board of Asheville Peak Academy Charter School. Pretty much anything that occurs for Black youth, Black and Brown youth in Asheville, Libby has had some hands in that. And we're so excited that she's part of our staff as the Director of Community-Led Grant Making. Welcome to the panel, Libby.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Great. So with that introduction, I'm going to let Desiree take it off and be our brilliant facilitator.
Well, thank y'all so much. I so appreciate y'all allowing me to spend the next couple of hours with y'all as we dig in. Thank you, Marsha, for grounding us in, what we're talking about and really thinking about what does liberatory philanthropy look like. As you were talking, I have some background in philanthropy, and all I kept thinking about, right, is all the systems and policies and that were in place. And it felt like philanthropy wanted to be right more than they want to be in right relationship with people and with community. And that's, I think, ultimately what Zedek has said. No, it is so important that we stay in right relationship with folks on the ground and with communities. And we're going to change and reimagine our policies, our practices, our ways of being and doing and behaving so that that can happen. So, y'all who don't know me know that we're just going to take this where it needs to go. I appreciate y'all giving me the ability to hold this space together. And we are not here just to talk. We are not experts, everyone in this room. So imagine we're actually not on Zoom, but we're in a circle in community together. And that's how this conversation is being. It's going to be way more conversational. Please raise your hand if you have questions. And you want to share. We're going to create time for Q&A, but know that we're monitoring the chat. So this is us being in community together, and there is space for all of us to be here, and all voices are welcome and celebrated. So let's jump in as we get going. This first question, I'm going to start off, and I'm going to ask Marsha, Althea, and Jennifer to really kind of start us off, and then Libby and Amy, y'all can definitely jump in on this one. But you've outlined these kind of best practices, and I'm sitting here thinking not only what's in it for philanthropy. Yeah, so let's start there. What's in it for philanthropy? Why should philanthropy take a hold of these practices and run with them?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. To supercharge your impact. I'll say that one of the things that we've really noticed, the more and more that we lean into social justice philanthropy, the more that we lean into trust-based philanthropy, the larger our impact and the deeper our impact is on our community. And so we are, there are so many ways in which pulling in community and centering the voices of those who are most impacted has allowed us to just discover some work that's happening in Asheville that's pivotal work that we might not have funded if we weren't listening and we weren't making sure that we're prioritizing the folks who have been impacted by these oppressions. I'll also say, not just does it allow us to find folks that we didn't know that we were going to find, but it allows us to really be in right relationship with our grantee partners, right? To not be in a paternalistic place where we're just giving money and saying like, great, we did our job and running away. That we're actually in a position where I will say that I feel, in fact, there's like an emotional benefit really to doing this work because I feel like I'm a part of a movement with other folks. I feel like we are actually trusted, not just as an organization, but as people with those that we are in partnership with. And what that means is that we get pulled into other collaborations as well, where we get to shift the needle on the items that we care about that we would not have been able to be invited into if we weren't in right relationship with our community partners. So they're pulling us into tables and conversations that we didn't even know were occurring and giving us the opportunity to like advocate and push the needle on some of these things. So it's really been, at least for us, a really beautiful partnership.
Great, thank you. Althea.
Sí, buenas tardes. Yo diría que parte de la esencia de filantropía desde el tiempo griego es poder ayudar al próximo, por amor del próximo. Entonces, filantropía en su esencia es el cuidado y el apoyo de nuestra comunidad. Y en su vida moderna, filantropía de veras valora tener un impacto, ser efectivo, y creo que en los últimos, por lo menos 20 años que yo he estado involucrada en la filantropía, descubrimos que los sistemas que hemos creado continúan en vez de ayudarnos a tener mejor impacto, estamos teniendo peor impacto cuando estamos a una distancia de la comunidad que estamos tratando de servir. Entonces, cuando tenemos nuestro interés como personas en filantropía más en mente para ser más efectivos, para ganar en el juego de filantropía, es esencial que nosotros estemos en relación con nuestras comunidades, que aprendamos juntos de lo que estamos creando. Yo sé que Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, GEO, por muchísimos años ha estado diciendo la misma cosa que esta encuesta dio resultados. Estar en relación con las comunidades, tener becas que son a largo plazo y también pensando muy egoístamente, cuando yo estuve haciendo becas, si yo tengo una beca que hacer por múltiples años, es mucho más fácil que beca por beca anualmente y es más efectivo para las organizaciones. Entonces, para nosotros es más eficiente y efectivo estar en comunidad y oír lo que la comunidad necesita para ser exitoso. Desiree?
Yeah, thanks so much, Althea. Jennifer, why don't you take that? What's in it for philanthropy?
Yeah, so I work in the organizational grant making processes here at the SEDEC Fund. And I think that for me, I understood the pain of having to ask for money and to manage grants on the other side. So when I started working here, I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much time and effort wasted when you're a grantee, like filling out a grant application and doing all the stuff you have to jump through. And there's so many questions, and often they're duplicative, and it's just like you're doing it over and over again. So I think for me, what's in it is, as Marsha and Althea talked about, is really increasing that impact, right? You're going to increase that impact. You're going to serve who you want to serve and support even more by getting out of the way. Because getting out of the way is really supporting them, but also, to be involved in a relationship, but to get out of the way enough so that you're not taking up their time and space. And I think, just in helping some of our current grantees look for funding, I've gone on to foundation websites and I'm like, goodness, there's so much that's asked. And in reality, the IRS asks very little of foundations. It's shocking. If you ever want to just have a fun time and research like what they require, it's very little. So I think we create these barriers for ourselves, not only for us working at foundations, but also for the people we want to serve. So
Thank you. Amy,
And
I'll let you have it.
I wanted to
coming,
piggyback on that. Oh, you're gonna come back? All right. Okay.
I'm coming back. Yeah, Amy, let's do a first round and then we'll come back for add-ons.
I am not sure that I can add a whole lot to what's been said. It's very moving to see from the beginning of where this whole thing started to where we're at now, in terms of really connecting and listening deeply to people. I guess for me, as I suppose I'm a philanthropist, although I didn't wake up one day and say that's what I wanted to be able to feel, Marsha, you alluded to this before, to be able to feel part of community, as opposed to sort of isolated over here with some mandate that I'm supposed to be an expert. No, like, and so to have a staff that is now made up that's stewarding this money and making decisions along with community of people who are based in the community is a beautiful thing. And it's very validating, that maybe this money can make a difference.
Yeah.
As
right.
can we as our whole selves. Thank you, Desiree.
Thank you. Libby, I'm going to let you add, and then we'll go back and have Marsha wrap up this question for us.
So what's in it for philanthropy to me is truth and reconciliation. If you look up the definition of philanthropy, it'll talk about the well-being, money set aside for humanitarian purposes, etc. But what it doesn't talk about is the truth of where philanthropy started and how wealth has been attained by the top, 1% of the folks in this nation, and how that wealth has been created off the backs of the working poor and out of slavery. And so it's important that philanthropy recognizes truth and steps into a space where there's an understanding that these efforts are also a part of individual liberation for those people who created these foundations.
That's right. That's right. You can't have, you can't be in right relationship with people that you don't trust. And you can't be in right relationship with folks when there is not a shared understanding of power and how y'all got there. Right? So those have to be core, right? Which comes back to the values that support the systems, the processes, and the structures in place. Marsha, I'll let you wrap this up.
Yeah, I think what's really important for us what's in it for philanthropy is the collective liberation piece. All of us, none of us may be systems, but we were all born into systems that somehow gave us some power and privilege or took power and privilege away. And I truly believe that these inequitable systems don't just hurt people who are oppressed, but they also hurt the folks who've been put into the position of the oppressor, right? And so when we talk about like collective liberation, I'm not just talking about folks who have marginalized identity. I'm also talking about like collective liberation for those who have been given power and privilege and were just born into it and did not actually ask for it. I actually think that there are a lot of people in positions of power and privilege who have this emotional weight that comes with being part of that legacy that they're ready to let go of. And so one of the things that I think that's been fascinating about this, also like watching Amy's process and being in proximity to her, is that there's also a way in which she's being liberated as we as a community are being liberated, right? That there is a way in which of being able to kind of counteract this toxic system that we were all born into, that really gave her wealth and assumed, and kind of put her in a position of having the expertise just because she inherited the wealth. It's how amazing it is to be able to share that emotional labor with community and to be able to start maybe modeling the kind of community and the kind of liberation that we say that we want to see. I think it's actually freeing for people in positions of power and privilege and wealth to start sharing and redistributing those resources as a way to kind of atone for like Libby said, the inequitable roots that they came from. I think that this is a process that allows all of us to be liberated, if we're willing to lead into it and do some of the messy work. But what we get on the other side is a more equitable society and more equitable relationships that liberates all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. If philanthropy is not working for Black and brown folks on the ground, ultimately it's not even working for philanthropists. And it may feel like it is, but the reality is it isn't. Right. And so we've got to build systems within philanthropy that are going to support and take care of our most marginalized communities. And when that is happening, when philanthropy works for them, then it's ultimately going to work for all of us. All right. So my next question really is about, so what does this look like in day to day, right? We can talk about theory, but what tangible practices and standards has SEDC used in moving to embrace these more liberatory, philanthropic, community-based focused practices? And I'm going to let you start, Libby, and then hit Jennifer, Marsha, and then open it up for Althea and Amy as well.
Okay, and that question was, what tangible practices?
Yeah. What does this look like in real life and working with community and doing the funding that y'all doing? What does this look like in y'all moving to this more philanthropic, trust-based practice?
And I'll start with, specifically for community-led grant making, a standard practice is being proximate with community. So it makes, you can't say we have a community-led grant making process and you sit up in some office somewhere and never get in community and relate and have conversations with individuals. And even though we hire fellows to support in that process, it's important for staff to also be in community and listening and having our ears open and being a part of other community activities, because community is often overtaxed, right? They get surveyed 3,687 times a year. And ask the same questions over and over again. So it behooves us to be present in other spaces, not necessarily sponsored by ZEDEC, where we also get to hear from community members about what is needed, what support they want, and who they want to support them. So being proximate is very important in terms of the work that we do, and also being transparent with our communication and our processes. So making sure that as we are showing up in community, that we do so authentically. One of the things that I learned as I stepped in this position with ZEDEC is that it takes a lot for community to trust and buy into a process, specifically a process that's new, with language that might be unfamiliar, like trust-based philanthropy, right? So when you start talking to people about trust-based philanthropy, and some folks you might see a blank stare, and it's not because they don't want it, it's because they haven't had the opportunity to build relationship and trust with you to know that when you say you trust them, you actually trust them as an organization, as a partner in community.
Yeah. Jennifer.
Can you ask the question once more?
Sure. What tangible practices?
Before you ask that, I just want to highlight something that Ethiopia just said in the chat, because that's something I should have said as well. Not only that they trust us, but that we trust them, and that there's a mutuality in the work that we're doing back and forth with each other.
Absolutely. And you mentioned something in the very beginning, right, around two pieces that we're going to dig in more about: transparency and accountability, right? Because those are two big, super important pieces that you don't stay in right relationship with anybody without transparency and accountability, and understanding that not if we have an issue, but when we have it, how are we still going to be committed to this work together? So thank y'all for both bringing that into the space. Jennifer, the question was really about what tangible practices, right, and standards have y'all used to help move from kind of traditional philanthropy to one that is more community-based, community-focused, and hopefully some mutuality around trust and power as well in it?
Sure. Well, one shift for us is providing grants to individuals, recognizing that leaders come in all shapes and sizes and at different levels. And there are a lot of leaders out there besides the community-led grant making. So I think that's really important, not just to look at people who lead organizations, but people who are doing all that work, right, that aren't always tied to organizations. And the nuts and bolts, I think, of the grant making process really. So at SEDEC, what we do is we have a pretty simple grant proposal, and we work with our grantee partners to fill that out every couple of years, right? So our norm is 3 and 5 year grants, general operating, unless someone specifically requests a project grant. So we give very few annual grants. And I think just it's a collaborative process. So I work with our grantees. Often some of them like to write in their own grant proposal information, but often we have a meeting and they just speak and share information with me, and then I capture it into our document. And so I'm usually writing, and then I send it back to them and I say, is this what you want it to look like, the grant proposal? And they'll either say, I want to add more information, or this looks good. And so it's a back and forth process. It's very collaborative. And I really want to take the burden off of our grantees during that process, because again, I understand the pain, right? And how much time is wasted. And also we have an annual check-in and report too, and that is a conversation as well. And again, through Google Docs, I capture the information as they speak. Before COVID, it was often in person, sometimes over a meal. And I would capture that information, and then they always had that privilege of adding or editing before we finalized that check-in report. And again, trying to, not have too many questions, but enough to really, so that people can just share, like, in the relationship, like, what are successes? What are the challenges? Is there any way that we could support you in a different way or better? And so we've got a lot of feedback that we look at, we address, and we incorporate that feedback into our process as well during these meetings.
Great. Thank you. Althea, you unmuted. You got something you want to add?
Sí, gracias. Creo que algo que hemos desarrollado a través del país es poder tener las aplicaciones en varios idiomas, donde el grupo no tiene que tratar de ponerlo en inglés, que no es su idioma predominante, y entonces que la fundación está tomando el gasto de traducirlo. Sí, que eso es una parte. La otra cosa es que cuando solo es basado en una aplicación en vez de una relación, perdemos mucho del buen trabajo que se hace con comunidades que no son alfabeto en inglés, no tienen alguien a quien le pagan bastante dinero para que escriba las becas. Entonces, ¿cómo hacemos no solamente una aplicación que es más fácil, pero que el proceso de dar una beca es parte de una relación, que uno va y ve el trabajo que están haciendo, se involucran en ese trabajo? Así que pensando que la norma no puede ser personas blancas que hablan inglés y que crecieron en los Estados Unidos que están escribiendo las becas, sino que somos una comunidad muy diversa a través del país, y definitivamente en Asheville también, en Carolina del Norte, definitivamente, y que empecemos a pensar un poquito fuera de la caja de cómo es la parte de aplicación para hacerlo, como dice Jennifer, más fácil en la persona que está aplicando, no necesariamente más fácil para la fundación. Pero si nosotros tomamos un poquito más de la responsabilidad de crear una beca efectiva, tenemos que darle un pase a las personas para poder hacerlo en la forma que a ellos les es más fácil.
Marsha, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of in terms of how we've implemented social justice philanthropy is how we've operationalized the idea of censoring those who are most impacted. So one of, we actually retooled our grant making checklist in terms of how we evaluate which organizations or which individuals are, eligible for funding, by using a term called impacted leadership. And we actually categorize both individuals and organizations on the scale of who leads and serves who are the leading and serving organization, meaning you serve folks who are BIPOC, LGBTQ plus, Jewish folks, and you are led by those institutions. And we prioritize those. I mean, those folks literally get more points in all of our ranking systems. And I think in some conventional circles, some folks might say that that's reverse racism, right? And the reality is what it actually is acknowledging that these folks have lived experience and knowledge and expertise that's going to help them address some of these issues that someone who actually has a more dominant identity might not have. No one understands better how white supremacy works than those of us who are being crushed by it. No one understands better how transphobia works than those of us who are being crushed by it, right? I mean, those folks are going to know more about the ins and outs of the system. How do you navigate that system? How do you survive and thrive in the middle of it? And so we've crafted these grant making processes that actually give folks more priority in the grant making process if they have that level of expertise. And that's both for our individual grant making and our organizational grant making. And I think that's important to note, not just because we're saying that this expertise is important, but also, I mean, Asheville is like a lot of other cities in that the large majority of our nonprofits here and the folks who are getting funding for their work are white-led nonprofits, right? So they may provide services to communities that are more marginalized, but predominantly all of the funding dollars that are given in Asheville are predominantly going to white-led organizations and paying for white staff, right? And so here we are. I mean, I think someone has given me, I've heard this fact pop up in so many rooms that I've been in, and I really wish I knew the source document. But someone said that, Asheville has more nonprofits per capita than any other city in North Carolina. And we also know that most of these nonprofits are led by white women, right? And so here we are in this world where, and as a city where white women are getting predominantly paid and funded by grant making institutions to be in really saviorist positions with our communities of color, with our LGBTQ plus communities, with our Jewish communities, right? And so here we are in a world where funding is actually encouraging people to have a saviorist mentality with the communities that they serve. We are encouraging people to be inequitable. We are encouraging people to consider themselves to be the ones who have all the assets, and the communities they serve have to be the ones with all the deficits, right? And so when you start prioritizing impacted leadership, both in the criteria for your grants, the criteria also for how we hire, the criteria for how we choose people for our board, what we're trying to do is counteract some of these toxic dynamics that occur not just in philanthropy, but in the nonprofit industrial complex, right? We recognize that there's this interplay between philanthropy and nonprofits that maintains some of this toxic dynamic, and that we've got to interrupt all of that with the way that we operate.
Great. No, that's actually, that leads me to a question that comes from one of the folks sitting with us in community today. One is, let's be clear, nonprofits were built in part for women in particular to overserve them. And so that they are led by white women who in part have taken on this savior role is not shocking, because that has been the role of these nonprofits from their beginning. But the question that has popped up, which I think is really interesting, is when y'all think about, and Amy, you can jump in this one too, when y'all think about kind of this liberatory philanthropy and trust building, how does that look the same, or how does that look different, thinking about the core folks that y'all work with, thinking about the LGBTQIA, the queer community? What does that look like working around white supremacy, anti-Semitism? What does that look like, working with Black and brown communities? Does that look different? Does it not look different? And how have y'all had to make adjustments around that? So who wants to be the first person to jump in on that question?
So I'm going to say this. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to say it. I'm going to let the words flow, and hopefully it'll make sense. So one of the things that was coming up for me as I was listening to Marsha speak is that not only do we have a culture of nonprofits where there are white women at the head, or people of color who are heading organizations that are supposed to be doing the work that impacts communities of color, but they aren't trusted, or they don't trust people of color to be heads of those organizations.
Yes.
So it's very interesting to me, and that what I feel like Zedek has done that's very different, is take away the stigma, and this idea that people of color can't be trusted to know what's needed for their communities and how it's needed, and to lead the efforts to do the work that needs to be done in community. I'm not sure that was a part of your question, Desiree, but that's what was coming up for me as I was listening to Marsha speak. And one particular organization came in mind, and thinking back over the history of how they funded in Asheville and all the work that they do specific to youth, and the idea of creating equity for Black and brown youth, to see that organization has very seldom had people of color in leadership. And then you look at Zedek, a smaller fund, who at the moment 50% of its leadership is composed of people of color, right? That to me is transformational. That's groundbreaking. That is the model that philanthropic organizations need to see. And that's this whole idea of how an organization like Zedek becomes proximate with community and starts to reflect its values in the people that it employs.
Right. So part of how trust building looked differently for different constituents is that these constituents are reflected back to them working in Zedek, right? Zedek got Black folks, Zedek got queer folks, Zedek has, Jewish folks and folks who are committed to building, right, and a deeper lens around anti-Semitism and white supremacy, right? The board also, I think, reflects this back as well. And so understanding that, and being strategic about how and what that relationship building looks like with each of these constituents is easier to do when you got those folks there with you who are there to say, hey, harm reduction, how do we make sure that we're doing this in a way that is strengthening those relationships and reducing harm as much as possible within these systems? Right. Amy, yeah.
Well, I think another way that SEDIC is increasingly reflecting community back to itself is that the programming that SEDIC is undertaking is bubbling up from community, as opposed to years ago before we took our pause and brought in 11 community movement leaders really to work with us for a year as we figured out where we were going. This isn't just a great idea somebody who's not firmly placed in community had. That's not how our programming is now.
Yeah.
And so it's just another tangible way that we've shifted that also speaks to your question too.
Yeah, and there's a point out, Tiffany and the audience shared that one of the reasons they applied for a ZEDIC grant is because of the investment into community and staff. So, right, we see that benefit. Y'all are reaping that benefit from being in relationship with community.
And one more thing, I mean, I think what Libby said, sorry, Marsha, about people of color, for instance, being in power in SEDIC is that white-led organizations can hire a person of color that then becomes kind of tokenized in a way, like, see, we're doing it, but without sharing the power.
Yeah.
So.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Marsha, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think Amy brought up something that I wasn't intending to comment on, but I think the key thing for us about equities is sharing decision-making power. So if you're not sharing decision-making power, at least from our perspective, you're not truly engaging in inequity work, right? What you're really doing is asking people to kind of come in and provide their expertise without you honoring their expertise by letting them make decisions about their own community. And I think that's crucial. The other thing that I think, kind of to answer the question you were asking earlier, that's important to know is that all of our staff are based here, and we don't all have none of us have, at least the staff, none of us have histories in philanthropy, and most of our board does not as well. And I actually think that's pretty critical. That my experience here has been as a Black queer woman married to a man of trans experience, that we are funding organizations that I needed to support my thriving in Asheville. Right? That each of us, part of the reason we know these organizations is because we've either volunteered with them, but also needed them at some point in time, right? So I can speak to most of the organizations in here and being like, Transmission in particular. Part of the reason I was able to land here and find the community that I needed was from Transmission. Part of my ability to see, queer youth being supported was Youth Outright. The YMI was this place that I would walk into and just get this inspiration from the deep history that the YMI is holding of our communities here of color, right? And I think this is not just a ground, supporting our racial justice people of color movements, but also our queer and trans and combating anti-Semitism movement as well. One of the things that I love about Zedek internally is that we're one of the most intersectional spaces I've seen in Asheville, right? In most spaces in Asheville, I can either be Black or I can be queer. And so it's really interesting to be able to be in an institution that understands that when we're talking about racial justice, we're also talking about queer justice, right? And trans justice. When we're talking about combating anti-Semitism, we're also still talking about queer and trans justice, right? Because we know that Jewish folks are not a monolith, that there are Jews of color, that there are queer and trans Jews of color. And part of the reason we know that is because each person on our staff has that lived experience, right? You can see the racial and ethnic diversity of our staff, but actually, that most of us are also queer and trans as well, is something that you may not be able to see, but that it's an important thing that we all are place-based, that we're all living in Asheville, interacting with community in Asheville. And that actually is part of our community research as well. Part of the reason we can lean into trust-based philanthropy is I don't need a report from most of these organizations. I see them doing it. Right? I was at Goombay the other day, right? Or I was at the WNC Black Business Expo. You're watching, or I just bought some earrings from Dope Diva Accessories, right? We are engaging with so many of these community leaders that it takes the onus of grant reporting off, because we are living and experiencing the impacts of all the work that they're doing in our city.
And we see firsthand as we navigate, as we go to the stores, as we are showing up in our places of worship, we get to see that the impact of that investment firsthand. So one thing I think is really important that I know came up in the report is to think about how and in what ways, what have been the benefits of Zedek kind of getting into repair, right? Because one thing philanthropy never talks about is repair and harm reduction. And I know that Zedek is really focused on this seeking to practice healing justice as a core part of philanthropy. It's not just important that we give out this money, but it's important how we do it. And that matters. And so what would you say to an organization are the benefits of really engaging and practicing healing justice in this work? Or are they just wasting resources? And Amy, I want to start with you, because I know this has been a critical piece for you, and your understanding of this work is, why is the healing and doing that work of transparency and building relationship important and necessary for funders to want to fund in communities?
Well, people are often fond of saying hurt people, right? So people who are carrying hurt either between communities, in a larger community, within an organization, or just from the stored trauma of having been alive, if you're going to make room for that healing, for that relationship building, every little piece of work you do, you can bring more focus, more authenticity, joy. Remember that word? You know, I think all of that becomes more possible. So,
yeah. Wow. I'm going to open up to anyone else who has some thoughts on that. But why is the practice of healing justice really critical for organizations if they want to do this work?
You know, I think it's another one of those things that we have to engage in to if you understand the toxic roots of capitalism and philanthropy, you have to engage in ways that are deeply relational and authentic. Because the reality is, a lot of organizations actually use philanthropy as a way to get people to ignore some of the toxic things they do in community, right? That they'll throw money at an issue to essentially be like, please don't pay attention to what we're doing over here with our left side, with our left hand. We are actually giving money to our community with our right hand. And, you know, our communities aren't children. They understand and they can see what that is. And so if we're starting to kind of say publicly that we're trying to shift the needle on just issues and we're not changing how we interact, then we're just part of reproducing those dynamics as well. Right. I mean, that just giving folks money, if you're not going to shift how you interact with them, is not necessarily going to change or repair some of these toxic relationships that we've had, right? And I think the other piece is the importance of modeling the culture and the vision that we want to see. Like Adrienne Marie Brown talks a lot about the idea that we are right now in a war of the imagination. That really the folks who are holding, who are invested in white supremacy, who are invested in these other forms of oppression, are controlling the cultural narrative around and telling us, like, yeah, you may want to destroy these systems, but like, what's the alternative? The alternative wouldn't be much better. And it's our job to make resistance and revolution irresistible. The only way you make it irresistible is if folks feel that they are transformed in your presence. If they feel that we are engaging with them in a way that feels different than these more extractive spaces. And so we're, you know, I think the way that we interact with people, having transformational experiences with them, is another way that we're actually using our capital to change the needle on some of these justice issues that we're talking about. It's not just about giving money, but it's also about modeling the culture that we believe should exist, right? Yeah. And so folks should feel as though when they come into our presence, they're being deeply respected for their expertise, and they just feel in their bodies a visceral experience of being in a less oppressive space. That's the hope, right? One of our co-directors, our former co-director, will always have a deep space in my heart because she taught me, you know, Dr. Heather Lane Talley taught me the importance of radical hospitality. You know, Southern woman from Louisiana, is just talked about how radical hospitality must be a part of how Zedek does our work. Because without radical hospitality, folks, you know, you may say all you want about how much you respect folks. You may use all the beautiful asset-based language in the world. But if when people interact with you, they don't feel as though they're being valued, that negates all of the stuff that we've said about what we believe. And so the radical hospitality piece is important. And we actually have incorporated that into our staff reviews. So staff gets a 360 review where each staff member has to name 3 people in community that they've interacted with. And we ask those community members, how do you feel, you know, in that person's presence? Do you feel as though you're being respected? Do you feel as though you're being heard? Right. Yeah. And that's another way that we operationalize that work and keep ourselves accountable.
All right. Everyone has something to say on this. I want to really ground us in understanding we can be transactional with philanthropy. Philanthropy can be transactional with philanthropy. We can only ever be transformational with people, right? And so understand that these systems, capitalism, philanthropy, we can be transactional with them all day long. But with folks, with humans, with community, we have to always be transactional. So I'm going to just start how I see them. Althea, and then Amy, and then Jennifer, and then Libby.
Gracias. Quería decir que una cosa que muchos en filantropía han descubierto a través del proceso de COVID es que importante y esencial son las personas en la comunidad que están haciendo el trabajo día a día. Y si los tratamos como si fueran maquinitas, haciendo nuestro trabajo que le pagamos a través de una beca, entonces no hay transformación para las comunidades a las cuales queremos ayudar y apoyar. Entonces esa relación de curación o sanación con las comunidades y con las personas que trabajan en las organizaciones es esencial. Y he visto que muchos en filantropía durante COVID hicieron cosas que nunca habían hecho antes. Dieron becas sin aplicaciones, sin reporte, dieron becas general operating, operaciones generales, dieron becas para el apoyo emocional, el bienestar de las personas que estaban trabajando en la comunidad, en las organizaciones. Hicieron cosas novedosas en relación cuando les estaban oyendo lo que necesitaban. Entonces, estoy con Desiree que es transformador estar en relación con la comunidad y hacer lo que ellos necesitan en vez de lo que nosotros pensamos que necesitan. Y COVID nos enseñó eso.
You're muted, Desiree. Were you just
Amy,
calling?
I was
Okay.
calling you.
It looked like you were looking at me, but I don't know how everybody else is zooming us. I think that, SEDIC has really evolved. And the practices that SEDIC is using now that were really outlined when we answered the first question about what are the practices are different than they were before. I think when we first started out, we a little bit more resemble traditional philanthropy. And so some of the healing and repair in community is not only building relationships and accepting a lot of direction and feedback from community, but just showing that over time we continue to do things differently. The multi-year grants, the kinds of reporting or the lessening of the burdening on reporting that Jennifer was talking about, the individual awards, all of that, already I can see that the community trusts SEDIC a little bit more, various people in community. So there was harm probably, particularly because we just looked like everybody else, and there's a way that people view philanthropy. Can we show up differently? What kind of healing is that going to provide over time? Just in terms of hope, even.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Jennifer?
Yeah, and I think this was touched on before, but I think funders really need to emphasize supporting healing, community healing practices. People are exhausted during COVID, and people are still exhausted. Mm-hmm. People are still sort of running in place. It's like everyone needed just some space to really heal, and that largely didn't happen. So I think besides just what's been happening over the past couple of years, and the increased, economic impact on people who are especially economically marginalized, Christian white nationalism loves the fact that we are siloed and that we're not healing ourselves so we can work together, right? So how are we going to transform all these systems that we're fighting against unless we take it upon ourselves to heal internally with each other? We heal from, anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, heterosexism, etc., and start working together too. And I think really those go hand in hand. We have to heal to be able to see another person's perspective. Mm-hmm. And Asheville remains very siloed, I think, often in a lot of organizing spaces just because of that. So I think for funders who can do that, really funding those spaces where people can actually take that time and talk about what does that mean to heal.
Yeah. And I think you're right. When I think about one of the things that COVID did, it allowed us, I think, to change narrative, right? Folks aren't just exhausted, they're exploited. And I think we're able to say those things more clearly because they're able to be seen more clearly across multiple identities, more so than they've ever been able to be seen before. So that spotlight that came on how we treat the working poor, how we, who's expendable, who's okay, and what ways is it okay for some folks to be exploited and others not. And I think that philanthropy saw some of the ways that it too was exploiting folks and not showing up as itself during this time period as well. Libby, and then Marsha, and then we got our last question, my last question before we open it up for everyone.
Two things. What philanthropy did during COVID, it could also do after COVID.
Absolutely.
And so I'm hoping that what we will see in the future is that there's less paperwork, there's more proximity, and there's a better understanding of what it means to support. And in terms of healing, whether it's a philanthropic organization or an organization in community, and I'm going to speak specifically to Asheville, healing is so important in the community, and particularly Black and Brown communities in Asheville, because the lack of healing keeps us not only siloed, but it keeps us in this defense mode where we are constantly defending ourselves against other organizations, and we are competing with those organizations for peanuts. And I do mean peanuts. And organizations and the government, city and county government, hold and dangle little carrots that keep organizations at odds with one another, so that they don't really realize the power that they have in the collective. Right? So as a part of the ZEDEC team, I think it's also important that we do as much as we can to provide financial support for healing in communities, so that grassroots organizations can come together and realize how similar they are versus being different, and maximize what they have in their individual organizations as a collective to be able to interact with philanthropy differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah. White supremacy, that's its main goal, is to keep us separate and small and fighting each other for a little bit of resources when we know that there's enough for all of us.
Exactly. And getting
there's
rid of that
philanthropy
mindset.
There's enough for all of us. There's enough for all of us, not just to survive, but to thrive. And philanthropy plays a big part in helping that narrative change and in releasing those resources to community so that we can thrive. Marsha?
And I just want to, before you, I'm sorry, I just want to answer Miss Betty, because she's been putting a lot in the chat. And one of the things that she said is, how can we change philanthropy so that it doesn't always fund the same well-known organizations? And I want to speak specifically with my knowledge and what has been happening in ZEDEC since I've been here, is that we don't fund those same well-known organizations. We are intentionally in community seeking out initiatives that we know nothing about, getting to know a deeper part of our community so that we can infuse funding into organizations, into groups that are doing work that we had no knowledge of. So, Ms. Betty, I would love to have another conversation about that with you.
Thank you for grabbing that off the chat, Libby. I appreciate that. Marsha, last thoughts on this question, and then I have one more that I want to ask y'all before we open it up.
Sure. I want to speak a little bit though to, I mean, we're talking a lot about the importance of collaboration and being in collectives, and that healing justice allows for that. I think there's also, I want to put a warning to some other funders about inauthentic and forced collaboration, that there are some funders who kind of emerge in the work and who like say to themselves, and actually in a way that it has, I will say as a grant seeker in my past, has felt really paternalistic, right? That a white person will, with wealth, because they're representative of an organization or a governmental body, will stand in front of the room and say, hey, you organizations, why don't you do better and collaborate? And they'll force collaborations through their funding practices. And what they don't really realize is, whether you're forcing collaboration or forcing separation, you're still the one holding all the decision-making power. And that doesn't really shift anything at all. And typically what they're doing is forcing these inauthentic collectives without actually spending the time to ask these organizations, who are you already currently in relationship with? Who are you already currently doing work with? Because what they don't also understand is a forced collaboration doesn't work, right? If you don't already have a relationship with another organization, having to write a grant that forces y'all together doesn't mean that you're going to be doing more effective work, because it takes at least a year and a half. As someone who's been on the ground doing this work, it takes at least a year and a half to build the trust between organizations to get the work to happen. The other things that I want to bring up is that COVID really highlighted for me the ways in which philanthropy gets in its own way, with the ways in which it adheres to white supremacy culture and this kind of worship of the written word and worship of the numbers, right? Is that here we were as an institution saying, oh, COVID's here. What we actually did is we blocked, we postponed the start of our community-led grant-making process, and we took that $250,000 and started giving it to organizations that were re-granting to people who needed the support in the middle of COVID-19. Now, what, I think the example that comes up to mind for me the most is speaking to Magali Urdialis, who was running the WNC Workers Center at the time. And we saw that they were re-granting to Latinx folks, undocumented folks who were workers on the ground. And we just said, okay, here's some money to give to the folks and to add to your funds. And what was really interesting is she came back and said, wow, so many of our funders were asking us, how are you going to meet your grant numbers in the middle of COVID-19? We need to have some reassurance that you're going to make the work happen, instead of actually giving them the support they needed to be able to quickly pivot. And she was also speaking to me about, in the middle of the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when some of the larger white-led organizations, I would speak to their representatives, and they're saying things like, yeah, we're not seeing a lot of cases in Buncombe County yet. And yet, if you spoke to folks who were part of these marginalized communities, they were already seeing deaths before a lot of these things were being reported, right? And so here was the WNC Workers Center that quickly pivoted and was buying like hotspots for people, teaching them how to access Zoom so that they can continue their organizing, giving people money because their partner had died within 2 days of getting sick, and they were lost in a situation and not really knowing how to handle that. And we would not have had the impact that we had in that moment if we weren't willing to trust the leaders of the movement and say, hey, here's the money, you decide where it's supposed to go. And one of the things that made, that I learned in that moment as well, is that philanthropy has the possibility, but not the will, to do things in more transformative ways. And because all it took, granted, all it took, it was a pandemic, but the quickness, which with a lot of funders all of a sudden dropped a lot of their more restrictive practices. And these are things that organizations have been asking philanthropists to do for a very long time. These recommendations are not new. And yet COVID came around and all of a sudden they were like, oh, we get it. We should start giving money out to those who are directly impacted. And it made it clear to me that the philanthropy does have the power to make a lot of these shifts that our organizations are asking for. But what it often does not have, and I think we need to be very abundantly honest about this, is that a lot of philanthropic spaces do not have the will, right? Yeah. And that the COVID pandemic kind of highlighted for us that if you do have the will, you'll find a way to make sure that money goes to folks who are most impacted.
Yeah. Before we're about to pivot and go into questions from y'all, one thing I would love for folks who are here, who are in philanthropy, to understand, y'all got to do your own internal work. You don't get to come and tell communities to collaborate if you can't collaborate. You don't get to come and talk to communities about power when y'all internally don't even have conversations about power, right? And so y'all have got to create structures and systems in place where y'all are modeling, and that y'all have built up your own skill and your own muscles around having the conversations, around being able to do repair work internally when y'all cause harm to each other, before y'all go out into communities and talk about what that looks, or what that should or should not look like in communities and poor or communities of color, right? So this is the last question, and before we go on, is I'm going to ask Amy and Marsha to speak to this, and then I'm going to open it up to what's in the chat and have people raise their hands. What advice do y'all have for white, cisgender, co-conspirator, folks in philanthropy who want to create trusting relationships and engage in a community research project, but don't know how to basically increase trust in this climate of real mistrust, right? we see white folks causing harm every day, all day long. And how do they do their work to help repair and rebuild trust with communities?
I guess, Marsha, would you like to start? All right. I have just a few things to say because it does start with relationships. But for me, I guess what I would say is like, find the place of humility inside yourself. Listen, learn. Most importantly, know that you don't know everything or even much at all about the experiences of community members who are positioned differently in community, and lead with that. And something I said on the last webinar, I'll say again, if you want to know, you have to actually want to know what people have to say. Because if you don't want to know and there isn't willingness to implement it, the whole thing is going to backfire. And people are probably going to be able to tell from the beginning. But even if they can't, I think that that's really important. And the other thing I would say is there is something freeing about sharing power. And so I would encourage people to work with that in themselves and in their organizations and take a risk, because wonderful things can happen.
You know, I would say that I think one of the interesting things about oppressive systems, especially white supremacy, is that it encourages you to dehumanize other people. And so we talk about building trust with communities as if it's this really confusing, complicated process. But could you think for a second about if there was another human being in your life that you want to build trust with, how do you engage? And most philanthropists don't engage in a way that makes sense if you assume that the other person is human, right? So, and you know, example of that is you wouldn't just go to one person's event and then be like, why don't you deeply trust me? Well, that's not how human relationships work. You don't build trust based on one interaction, right? You build trust by showing up, by being present, by being a place where someone can be vulnerable with you, by being someone who can actually take accountable for the times when you mess up, right? And so I often ask people, if you're thinking about how to build trust, think about how you would build trust with someone that you deeply value, and then try to do that on an organizational on an organizational level, right? Allow yourself to take the time to show up and be real with people, and not see their closed offness as being defensiveness, not see it as them being like not understanding the importance of linking in with you in relationship. I think there's so often when I watch these institutions and people with wealth and power, when they're not able to build trust with communities, blame communities for that and say, well, they don't understand enough why it's important to build trust with people who have power and privilege. That's actually not true. What we understand very, very deeply is how much we can lose if we trust the wrong people, and how much we can lose when we don't use discernment, and how many times people with wealth and privilege come into our communities in ways that are extractive and harmful, and ways that actually throw us under the bus later on, right? So you've got to be really understanding of the ways in which communities are somewhat insular and not very ready to trust, because people who look like you and love like you and worship like you have been deeply, deeply traumatizing to all of the communities that we represent aesthetic, right? So you have to come in with the understanding that there's a trauma response that's going to be triggered immediately just by your mere presence in those spaces. And you have to acknowledge your positionality and your power. If you haven't gone through the process of actually understanding what power you hold, and I don't mean just white cis folks, right? I mean also Black cis folks. I mean also, all of us who identify as Christian, right? Especially in the South, people. Right? All of us who are able-bodied, right? I'm not going to walk into like, a predominantly trans space and act as though I don't have privilege in my cisgender body, right? Even though I'm a Black queer woman, I've got like oppression up the wazoo. But I also have to acknowledge the places where I have privilege. I'm not going to go into a Jewish space and assume that I don't have privilege as someone who's Christian in a culture that has holidays that all match mine, that have, cultural norms that all match my faith, tradition, and norms, right? So you have to step into those spaces if you're going to build trust, as though you expect those other people to be human, with human histories, human pasts, and human discernment about who they can be in relationship with or not. And so, if you're asked, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, because we got to go on. The question is not, are community folks trustworthy? It's, are you trustworthy? Is philanthropy at its core trustworthy? Right? And so, it's not like, do I want to partner with you? Are you partnership material yourself? Like, there's so much our own internal personal work that we have to do before we are ready and able to be in community with one another. And then the last piece I will say, if philanthropy learns nothing else, learn to apologize for the impact that you've had, not for your intent. Learn to apologize for the harm that you have done. Because until we talk about that history and the ways that you've shown up, you cannot expect me to feel like, yeah, I want to be in relationship with you when you cannot even say, when you're not showing me, one, that you understand what you did wrong and showing me change behavior. And philanthropy needs to have other folks in philanthropy that they process that with, not with the communities that they're working with. Right? And so until philanthropy sees accountability not as punitive, but as a way to stay in right relationship with people and a way to build community and to deepen community, then philanthropy will never be able to be trusted. And that's essential ultimately to this work. So we're going to open it up to questions. Right? So I just want to make sure with our interpreters, the best way to do this is to have folks raise their hand and we call on folks and have folks ask the question themselves. Yes? Okay. So please, if you have a question for any of the panel, Tiffany, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you all for your time. This was definitely a worthy conversation. I appreciate it. This question I have goes to Marsha. Early on in the beginning, when you spoke about the key themes, but you mentioned building relational trust. And my question is not from a philanthropist perspective, but from community. How can we build trust with our philanthropists? Like the relational trust.
To be honest, Tiffany, that's a great question, but I actually haven't thought about it a lot because I think the reality is, if you're out there in the world and you're doing deep, impactful work, a good philanthropist hopefully should find you and have trust in the work that you're doing. But I think one of the things, sadly enough, that a lot of organizations need to take the time to do is start learning how to tell their story. Right. And so I think there are so many folks, both individual leaders in our community and organizational leaders in our community who don't talk enough about what they're actually doing. Right. And so part of the reason Zedek staff knows some of these organizations is, because we've seen them in action, or other community leaders will say, hey, by the way, here's who I trust. Right? Here are the folks that I'm doing work with that I know will be there at the end of the day. So folks can refer each other. But I think it's really important to do some real storytelling, right? What's the problem that you're solving? And not necessarily storytelling through grant reporting, but finding ways for folks to understand on a more public forum what it is that you do, website, social media, that kind of thing. And so I think it's just important so that you're controlling the narrative about your organization and not just trusting that people will find you, organically.
Yeah. Althea?
Oh, sorry.
Althea first and then you, Libby.
Hace años, cuando yo trabajé con hispanos en filantropía, una de las cosas que vi que admiré muchísimo fue las organizaciones que en vez de verse como menos que una fundación, se veían como colegas con la fundación y hablaban como colegas y los trataban como colegas. Y cuando la fundación no hacía algo bien, se los decía como un colega. Entonces no daban marcha atrás como yo no puedo decir nada porque yo dependo de su dinero. En vez decían, mira, vi que hiciste esto es otra forma de hacerlo, esto es una solución, ¿por qué no pruebas eso? Y los tenían responsables por sus acciones. Entonces, sé que eso puede ser difícil, especialmente cuando una organización depende del dinero de una fundación, pero si Tiffany, me encanta tu pregunta, que es con mucho coraje y valentía. Si uno quiere tomar la responsabilidad de mejorar la relación, tienes que cambiar la dinámica, por lo menos en tu mente, aunque no se haya cambiado todavía en la mente de la fundación, que son colegas con la misma, el mismo conocimiento, la misma experiencia, la misma sabiduría, y tratarlos como colegas.
Yeah.
And I would add to that that it isn't just that you are colleagues, but you are actually the experts. In my other life, it was very challenging sometimes because when I had to speak to funders, I didn't have that ability, or maybe I don't know, stubborn, I don't know. But this whole idea that they were the ones with the information and the power was a challenge for me because I felt like I needed to show up as my authentic self with the knowledge that I had, because I'm the person that's in community. I'm the person that's working with these folks. And so a funder for me couldn't come and tell me what my community needed because the funder was not in community with me. I was there. So really being honest and recognizing, and I know it's hard, but all money is not good money. So if in order for you to get money from a funder, that funder has to feel like they are somehow risen above you and you're some, peon that they just happen to help. That's not healthy, right? So just recognizing that you, as the person in the organization, as the person doing the work, you're the expert. And if they value you and your expertise, they recognize and they want a partner. And if they don't value you, they're probably not the right fit for you to begin with.
I just want to say wealth does not equal expertise, no matter what philanthropy is trying to tell you, right? That often, yes, they have the money, but if we had to go down into like our different legacy neighborhoods in Asheville and knock on doors and start to organize, many of the philanthropists who would be funding your work wouldn't know how to do that, wouldn't know how to start organizing our community. So it's important to understand that y'all have skills that we don't have, no matter how official we like to look as philanthropists or funders.
Yeah. And I think if you're thinking about how do I build deeper relationships with certain communities, y'all have to ask yourself better questions, right? So I think some of those questions are not, it's what Victor Ray says. It's not how do I get in relationship with more Black and brown folks. It is really, the question is, why does so much power lay in the hands of white folks? Right? So it is about literally starting to really begin to think about, why does so much power lie in your hands and not in community hands? And what will it take to move that power, those money, and those resources back to where it belongs? Any other questions? You can raise your hands. You can unmute yourself. Anything that we missed? I think let me go back to the chat. I think that someone did ask a question around that, Jennifer, like what yeah, let's think about what have been some of the biggest challenges the Zedek has kind of had to face and in this work as y'all transitioned from more traditional based to more community-led, community-focused, liberatory practices. So Jennifer, I will start with you since you've actually been there. You and Amy, y'all have been there, been involved the longest.
Sure. I think for us, at least from my perspective, just we had to go through a lot of internal change. And I think for us, that was the most challenging thing. It was like, we started out as a donor-driven fund with one person, Amy. And I think that process of Desiree, you did an equity audit on us a while back. And then the findings from that equity audit really kind of started things. And so we looked at like class issues. We looked at, started looking at race and, all sorts of things, economic. And I think it was just an emotional journey that we had to go through. It took a good 2 years, I think. And I think that a lot of organizations have to go through that journey as well. And it takes time. And I think sometimes people want to go through it really quickly. But really, it's a multi-year process. If you really, we're talking about getting free and freeing ourselves. Well, funders need to go through that to free ourselves, but also nonprofits as well. There's that process. And I think for us, and to be frank, I think as funders, we're still fairly ego-based. I'll just say that about myself. But I often think of like, what would benefit SEDC, just to be perfectly honest. And I don't always think like, oh, this would actually benefit us more than the folks that we're trying to serve. So I constantly kind of have to go through that check too. And I think we do struggle with that as an organization. I think we continue to do so sometimes. But that was also something we struggled with as well. Like instead of serving ourselves, we're really trying to serve a bigger purpose.
Yeah. Amy, I'm going to give you a minute to add anything to that. And then I have a question from the audience.
I think that Jennifer said it well. I think there's probably more to say, but I'm going to pass on that.
Oh, thank you. So, and because we're all, experts here with our own lived experience. So if y'all have ideas about how y'all move funders, please share those. But also the question is, what are some good examples of funders working with other funders where they help to move each other, right? Like where there was that collaboration and where the idea of the old structures were transformed, where power was shared between partners and collaboration. So y'all have any real life examples that y'all can share where y'all have seen this happen in community?
That happens quite a bit in, philanthropic spaces, to be honest. We engage in what we call philanthropic advocacy, and we're in circles, we're in conversations where we see change happening, and they're working with other funders that they say they need help, and so we work with them on how they might be, more in relationship, adopt more trust-based practices. So we see it actually quite a bit. It's a little slow because philanthropy moves at the pace of dinosaurs, but it does happen.
Yeah. Althea?
Sí, conozco muchas organizaciones, muchas fundaciones a través del país que empezaron dando becas a organizaciones trabajando con inmigrantes y comunidades refugiadas. Y entonces había una organización que era una colaboración de otras organizaciones y dijo, pero ¿por qué ustedes están decidiendo si nosotros sabemos cuáles organizaciones necesitan los recursos? Y crearon un comité de organizaciones que ellos iban decidiendo las becas aún para ellos mismos y para otros, y crearon, transformaron como estas fundaciones estaban haciendo las becas. Entonces, tomó tiempo, como dice Jennifer, esto toma tiempo para que las fundaciones y en particular las juntas de directores de las fundaciones tomen confianza con el proceso, pero ya en varias comunidades a través del país van muchos años donde las organizaciones en sí, los becados, deciden las becas y las fundaciones van aprendiendo más de lo que se necesita en esas becas. Entonces, es posible, y yo creo que lo que hemos visto con COVID, me encantó lo que dijo Libby, estos aprendizajes de COVID no tenemos que perderlo. Siempre han sido buenas prácticas para la filantropía, entonces podemos continuar a hacer la misma cosa y seguir aprendiendo de eso.
Yeah. And learning in public, right, is one of those liberatory practices of sharing what worked, what's failing, how you apologized, how you repaired, how you moved on. All of that is super critical to changing what we think is possible in this work. We have one last question, and then Marsha, I'm gonna hand it to you so you can wrap us all up. But the question is, what are y'all's thoughts on social innovation, social enterprise, kind of impact investment? Them being in this philanthropic space and their efforts. And are there some collaborations of what, these kind of entities that y'all can really speak of that have worked?
I think those types of investments are critical, and I think marginalized communities have been asking for that for a really long time. It's really interesting how those of us with wealth and power think that most communities are asking just for charity or whatever we define as charity. But the amount of social enterprise that exists in most communities, and definitely here in Asheville, that does not get supported by philanthropy, because we're usually stuck supporting 501c3s instead of supporting, and there are, legal IRS reasons for that. But one of the things that I think is great about supporting, doing impact investing and supporting social enterprise is not only are you then shifting the needle on some justice issues, but you're also providing the opportunity for folks to build generational wealth, right? And so I think it's really crucial that philanthropy engages in those things wherever they can, in part to just kind of counteract the ways in which most of the communities that we represent have been left out of a lot of the wealth building and development building that's happening in Asheville in particular, and just across the nation. We've been really left out. I think the example of collaboration, there's way too many to name, but I will speak to so one of the things that I'm seeing that I following lately that I'm really interested in is the Denver Basic Income Project. So that's a group of philanthropists that have come together and in partnership with social entrepreneurs to give a basic income to some of their houseless population in Denver. And the preliminary research that's coming out of that is really positive in that, giving unhoused people a basic income actually has a deeper impact and a quicker impact than having them go through a lot of the shelter systems and the housing nonprofits that we have set up, right? So if you want to answer the question of how do we house unhoused people, either just give them houses or give them money. I mean, the response is pretty simple. And I think social entrepreneurship and impact investment gives us the opportunity to start investing in some of these solutions that also put money back in the hands of the people who are leading the work.
And I will add this, and if I'm wrong, y'all definitely tell me. I think philanthropy and social impact and social enterprise was really, and I think it's because it was easier to focus on the environment, right? Like you see a lot of that happening in the environmental space. And I think it's just now more and more is coming actually into more racial equity spaces, because they realize, right, the intersection of being able to do the environmental work without that racial equity lens does not work, right? And so having and bringing this lens into all of these different sectors and types of work ultimately is helping us all. And so I personally love to see more of that coming into deeper racial equity work, just like it's really been helping to push forward some work around environment and climate crisis. So I'm going to stop there. I know y'all probably have more questions, but I just want to thank y'all for allowing me to let some of this great stuff bubble up with the group today, the genius that's on the panel, but also that's in the audience. And Marsha, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone on our panel, for just the beautiful things that you shared. I have loved being in this conversation because we get to show our community and other funders the types of conversations that we're having behind the scenes all the time. And so if this conversation felt new to you, either as a funder or as a nonprofit leader, what I would encourage you is to really practice with each other, having these conversations, being really honest with each other. The reason we have these learnings to share is because we've actually been doing the deep internal work. And also give yourself time. I want to echo what Jennifer said. make time for your organization to do the deep relationship building work at both within your organization and with community. So again, I think the messages we're leaving y'all with is listen deeply to your community, to the folks who are already doing the work, who are already invested in the communities that you and in the justice issues that you want to shift the needle on, and amplify those voices. It's about time for us as philanthropists to get out of the way, to see us as ourselves as not leading the work, but being part of the work and supporting the work that is already happening in these communities that we say we want to serve. Right. So thank you again for not just the panelists, but all the people in this space. I'm seeing some folks who are Impact Award winners, who are part of our community at Zedek. And so I'm just honored that you're here supporting us and continuing to build that relationship. Hopefully it means that we've built some trust with you as well. So I would invite everyone to keep coming in to the rest of our webinar series. You can find more details on our website and registration links on our website. And the recording for this webinar and the future webinars will be on our website as well. So share widely. And on that note, have a great Tuesday. I'm going to share a little bit of music with you as we make our way out, and hope that you have a wonderful day.